Okay, welcome to this episode of Digital Diary. This time we're actually going to be talking about shrinkage, which is something that happens on all quilts. Basically, as you take those stitches in the quilt top, it starts taking up and pulling and drawing in all of the fabric together. And so the quilt that you start with is probably going to be bigger than the quilt that you end with. And it's usually not a big deal when you're hand guiding the machine because you can just account for that as you guide and quilt along. But as digital quilters, we have to address it in different ways and know when to recognize it's going to happen and have different methods of actually addressing it. So, our panelists today, we're going to talk about a lot of those issues. Um, First off, I think we just need to recognize what where it actually happens, right? So you can see it when you do an edge to edge and it runs off the edge of the quilt, right? You start on one side and it goes and it runs all the way off the edge and you're quilting in the batting on the other side and you're going, I know I marked that edge right where it needed to be, but it's going over. So that's going to be one of those areas. We get it when we're talking borders. And so we have to think about it when we go to, put all of those borders in. And once we start quilting part of it, it's going to start shifting where those lines of the quilt top actually fall. And so we can address it in a couple of different ways. We can address it either on the computer side, right? We can address it by tools and tricks in the software itself, or we can address it with the actual quilt itself and our physical hands on the quilt. So let's just go ahead. I have a quick little slideshow that has some pictures so we can actually show some of the shrinkage issues, and we'll go from there. Okay, Paige, you want to talk about these real quick?
Okay, this is shows you the effects of shrinkage. These are just some pillows I did. I marked off on a plain fabric, and that is the upper left-hand corner, using my large square. So it's a 20.5-inch square. I used a Choco liner, so I know what I started with. I then quilted, and I am using on this one polyester batting, which has a little bit of poof to it, so you will get more shrinkage, and a very dense design. And that again will add to the shrinkage, the density of your quilting. I marked off the same square. I started by lining it up in the upper left-hand corner. So you'll see in the last slide here that my lower right-hand corner really did show how much that shrank. So I am looking at just over a 1/2 inch of shrinkage, both up and down and left and right, on a 20.5-inch square. So that's a pretty good shrinkage. It's real.
Shrinkage is indeed real. And you brought up a very good point, which is the materials that you use and the patterns you choose definitely affect how much shrinkage you're actually going to see on the quilt.
Yeah, on a show quilt, I can get a 3-inch shrinkage over the course of that quilt, but that is a lot of stitching, and I plan for it. I know it's there.
Well, do you want to talk a little bit about how you go about planning for it? Because I know you typically load differently than I do, and a lot of that is to help manage some of that shrinkage, right?
Yeah, well, you talked about, go to the next slide,
Okay.
and that I believe is the borders.
No, it's mine.
Oh, okay, never
No,
mind.
it is borders. You're
Well,
right.
okay, good. So I do plan on having shrinkage and on a really long border, and I think this quilt was almost 100 inches long. I like to manage it from the quilt side by stitching in the ditch. That helps to stabilize it. So I'll do that first. The other thing that I am very diligent about is I load both my top and my backing. So I try and cut down on shrinkage there,
As opposed to floating, right?
as opposed to floating. And depending on what you're doing, there's different reasons for it. So here I put my border in, and I did use the border corner feature, but I take my last segment and my corner and I toggle it as unsewn. So once I stitch this, the black part's going to stitch out. I know I'm getting shrinkage there. When that has done, I'm going to delete that boundary and put in a new one. And then I'm going to take that last segment and the corner and toggle it as unsewn. But that looks good on my screen, but it may not reflect where my quilt moved to on the frame. So if I put my machine head right where that stitching ended on my quilt, if I look into the screen, you can see that that is back a ways from where it shows on the screen. And so at this point, I would relocate or I would elongate just that one segment to make sure that I am fitting what's on the screen with what's on the quilt.
Well, and this is one of those big issues of people always ask, do you chunk or do you turn for borders? And this is really why we would do one or the other. And even if you're going to chunk, you have to account for a little bit of shrinkage, right?
Yep, I am a turner. I will do the corners, I do the top border, the bottom border, and then I do turn. But there are other ways to do it, and I know there's people on the panel that prefer to chunk.
Karen, you want to talk about chunking a little?
So I'm one of those people that does generally chunk my borders, meaning I'm placing those repeats as I go down the quilt. I do this because, well, okay, for one reason, it's just habit. That's kind of how I learned. And I'm with Paige. I know that there's not just one way to do anything. So this happens to be my method that works for me most of the time because I generally have very little shrinkage in my quilts. And I believe that is because of several factors. One of those is that I don't over tighten my quilt sandwich. I do float my quilt tops, so there's very little tension on my top fabric. There's very little tension on my backing fabric. I generally use a very low loft batting. So, your flatter battings, your 80/20s, that's what my customers want. So that will reduce shrinkage and shift because it doesn't have as much loft. My thread tension is really loose, so it doesn't draw up as much when I'm stitching. And most of the patterns that I use are not very, very dense and elaborate. So those are some of the reasons why I feel like I rarely run into shrinkage issues. Sorry.
Okay, can I
And
ask what stitches per inch you use?
my standard is the 12 stitches per inch.
Okay, I use more, and that's probably why I'm seeing more shrinkage.
Mhm.
That's a great point, actually, because the more holes you put in a quilt, the more stitches you put in a quilt, whether it's because the pattern is dense or because you have a higher stitch count, that is going to cause more drop. Every stitch you put in a quilt changes the quilt, changes the shape of the quilt. I agree with that.
So any other issues, any of the other panel want to talk about borders before we move on to like fills and other issues?
I have a different way that I set up borders. I think about the pattern, and so I'm wishy-washy. I will turn sometimes depending on if it's a very scrolly or feathery pattern. I will definitely turn. But if it's something very linear, like a piano key or something easier to chunk, I chunk. So I kind of go back and forth on my methods. And the other thing that I consider is if it is a show quilt and I don't want so much thread starts and stops, I always turn. So I kind of go back and forth just depending on whether it's a show quilt or not and the pattern.
So really there's no one way to address it. There's lots of different ways depending on really what the quilt is telling you and what patterns you're using, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this next one is a picture of a quilt that I've quilted. And what I just wanted to point out, I was doing lots of fills on this quilt, which means I'm getting the stitching to run right up to the edge of either another line of stitching or right up next to the edge of the piecing. And what you can see is on the quilt top itself, like my stitches go right up to the edge, right? All the way up to the edge. But if you actually look and see what the screen says, what digitally is represented by the patterns I have on my screen, there's a gap there. And there's some points where it's running over, right? It doesn't look good on the screen, but it looks good on the quilt. And so this is one of those areas where I'm addressing that shrinkage in the software itself. And I'm not worrying about what it looks like so much as making sure that the representations of that quilt are valid when I'm stitching that exact section. So just know that because of shrinkage, you may have what's on the screen may not actually represent what you see on the quilt, and that's okay. And the other thing with this is you're going to see a lot more shrinkage because this is fairly dense quilting. I think these are quarter inch lines through here. So some of these are closer together than even a quarter inch. So you're going to see a lot of that shrinkage a lot faster than if it were less dense. Okay. So this is just another example, and the big thing here, you can see in the digital representation of this quilt, you can see I have some lines that are running over the top of other patterns, and the patterns themselves do not look clean on the digital representation of this quilt in the screen. And a lot of that is because I've kept all of these patterns on my screen through several relocates as well, right? And so when I'm using these many patterns on my screen, I'm also having to make sure that when I do those relocates, I'm choosing a good spot to do the relocate, and I'm not paying as much attention necessarily to the patterns that I've already stitched. I'm just making sure the pattern I'm placing at that exact moment in time is where it needs to be. Okay. But we can actually use shrinkage to our advantage. It's not always a problem, right? So we do get quilts in that are a little bit of problem children, right? So you want to talk about this one a little, Paige?
Okay. This is a quilt, and it was very obvious that all of the blue squares were cut too big. And this happened to be a vintage one, but it happens today. And I use shrinkage to my advantage by quilting all the pink ones first. That way, that area was shrunk up and it stretched out the blue so that I was able to put the designs into the blue after the fact, and I had less puffiness in the fabric. So again, I was planning ahead, planning on shrinkage, and this time used it to my advantage.
Very, very cool. Okay, so this is another one page that you sent us where you were using shrinkage to your advantage. And this also goes into how you load quilts normally.
Okay, I generally do load my tops, and I get down to the bottom and I take it off the zipper. And in this case, my top was a little bit longer than the backing. And if I would have just quilted it as it was, I would have quilted over those pins. It was minky. I could have stretched it, but that would have really made it worse. It would have curled up. So what I did do was I allowed this to float instead of stabilizing it by stitching it down the sides, and it was able to shrink up enough that I cleared that zipper. Not by much. You can see at the bottom how much I was able to salvage at the bottom was just enough that went onto the zipper.
So this is one of those cases where, depending on how you load your quilt, you're going to see more or less shrinkage. So in this case, she took it off the full load. She has that big poofy poly batting. Use that to her advantage.
Yeah, and sometimes if I know my backing is tight, I will do a loose load. It's still attached to the leader, but I never tighten
You
it
don't
down.
tighten it as
And
much.
that's
Yeah.
what Karen was talking about. She keeps everything looser, but if I tighten the back and loosen the top, the shrinkage is going to be more evident on the top. And I think, Deanne, you had talked about this.
Well, I know that some people have asked before, if you have shrinkage on the top, do you have shrinkage on the back as well? Well, and it comes down to how you load it. If your back is rather tight, then you're going to have less shrinkage than if it's very loose. And so that can be an advantage or a disadvantage depending on the back that you have. Because if it's pieced, you're going to want it tight, or that shrinkage can also cause foldovers. So keeping your back tight if you've got piecing.
Okay. So again, you can use it to your advantage when you need it. The point is we need to recognize that it's going to be there and know lots of different methods in order to use it to our advantage. Okay, I think, Karen, this is one of yours, right?
Yep, so this is one of my real life examples of shrinkage and the problem that it caused on a quilt for me. So I wish I could say that I did this on purpose just for this episode so that I'd have some material for showing everybody shrinkage. But that's not what happened. I just wasn't paying enough attention. I wasn't watching for it. So I did have an issue you can see on the left where my stitching went into my blue border a little bit. Not very much, but obviously the white thread is pretty obvious on there, and I'm going to have to take care of that. So basically what happened with this quilt is I didn't really do any stabilization. I wasn't going to do any stitch in the ditch on the quilt. It was loaded fairly loosely, which is my typical way of doing things, but I was taking advantage of draw pattern feature and placing triangles all the way across a white on point row and then all the way back, doing half of that on point block at a time. So when I had the Statler stitch all the way across a white row and back, by the time I got back to the beginning, you can see the difference between the top triangle and the bottom triangle. And that's not because I placed the patterns wrong, and it's not because things shifted on screen. That's because the quilt had some draw up, and the quilt itself actually moved so that that perfect pattern was stitching exactly where I told it to stitch, but the quilt had moved. So then I have to fix that problem with this particular stitching. But even more important than that is I needed to plan for that in the future for the next roll. And we already talked about a couple of the things that we can do to deal with shrinkage. If we're planning for that shrinkage, we can either adjust patterns on the screen. So that was one of the options I had, to just kind of shift the last pattern over a little bit. Or I usually choose with a project like this to just use my hands and do a little surfing. So when I get to the end design where I know that I might be a little bit close to that border or to that boundary, I just use my hands to make sure that I pull that quilt so that it's still in the position it was when I started the row.
Hands-on surfing. Yay.
Yes, I do hands-on quilting.
That's all right. I do a lot of surfing too, but mine is usually a little bit tinier because I'm doing lots of really dense work. Okay, so another way we can use this surfing or shrinkage to our advantage. This is an example where another curved quilt and I think this one is from you, Gina,
Uh-huh.
where there's definitely some poofiness in the middle of that double wedding ring, and we need to take some of that out. You want to talk about it a little, Gina?
Yeah, this quilt actually was even poofier than it looks on the photo in those white middle areas. And so I did want to use shrinkage to my advantage. So I did stitch uh, in the ditch, but I did do the little ring areas first to kind of pull it, trying to pull it outward a little bit while I did it with surfing as well. And then I used a real dense pattern in the middle and did a lot of hand surfing to get those poofs under control to try to even them out through that pattern. But I had to stitch very slowly. I had to turn my speed way down so that I could surf that one enough to even it out through that middle pattern. It was
Well,
quite a challenge, but it was kind of fun to be able to manage it with shrinkage. I always love that when you're able to fix something that would have been a problem.
well, and I think that's another good thing to point out is typically when we're dealing with these shrinkage issues, changing up your speed and slowing it down is always a good thing.
Mhm.
I know when you're getting to the end of a section of border, just going and slowing that machine head down so that it's stitching slower so we can make sure it lines up so that we can do any of that surfing that we need to. I think that's one of those big tools to just know and put in your toolbox and say, hey, I can be in control of the speed of this machine. It's not in control of itself, right? Okay. And I think this is another example from Eugenia where you're using that shrinkage obviously to your advantage.
Yes, this quilt was a real big challenge. The piecer didn't really want to repiece it, but the top width was about at minimum 10 inches wider than the middle width, and the bottom width was also about 10 inches wider than the middle width. So, of course, I love challenges like this to use shrinkage to my advantage, but I had to stitch in the ditch first so that I could adapt this shrinkage evenly over the course of the quilt. And the quilt, of course, got a lot smaller than what it was prior because it really wasn't square. To get it square, I had to really shrink up certain sections of the quilt, especially like that V at the very bottom. That was one that was a real challenge. But again, I stitched it in the ditch and I did the middle first of that quilt, and then I was able with shrinkage and hand surfing to get all that fabric maneuvered into a real dense background pattern. And I was so excited when that quilt came out square.
So I think, let me just go ahead, let's go back to our little gallery view of all of us. Um, I think really to summarize, I mean, stabilization. A lot of us do a lot of ditch work, right, to stabilize the area so that we can minimize that shrinkage. Then we go and we adapt our the program. We either draw new boundaries every time, right? So we're only dealing with a small section of the quilt. We do surfing. We keep in mind not only does loading matter, how we load the quilt, how we base that quilt, but also materials, your material choices. How is the batting choice and the pattern choice going to affect it as well? Those denser patterns are going to shrink more than the looser patterns. So, if you're not worried about it, You can go ahead and throw on a lot of those really loose patterns and it's not a big deal. But if you're going to do those little tight, dense things, it's going to happen a whole lot more. I want to just do a quick roundtable and see, you guys want to finalize your thoughts?
You know, I think it's the important take home from this episode is that shrinkage is real, obviously. It's something that if you think about it before you get started with the quilt, you're going to be a lot better off. So my example was perfect. I didn't think about it, and so I got caught. And we've talked about a lot of things that we can do to kind of mitigate for shrinkage, but it really comes down to every single quilt is different because all of the things that go into that quilt are different. But there's a lot of, there's good education. There's a lot of good classes that talk about shrinkage and some of the things that we can do about it. So don't forget that there's more education out there. There's more resources than just what we've given you today in this short little episode.
Absolutely.
For me, I deal with shrinkage a lot through, I'm constantly drawing boundaries, and I do relocate. The type of quilting I do is generally denser, and especially on my custom stuff. So relocation, new boundaries. Karen's right. There is shrinkage on everything, and I think most of our classes do have at least one reference to shrinkage because it's real. So if you go to the GAML website and you do a class on borders, you know there's going to be some reference to shrinkage there. It's a great resource.
Deanne?
Shrinkage is not something to be afraid of. It's going to be there because we're quilting to the CAD screen and not to the quilt itself the way that hand guiders do. And just anticipate it. Know that on an edge to edge that one side may go beyond the border that you had placed on the CAD screen, and that's okay. If you don't want it to, then we plan for it, like we've talked about in the different ways. And so just don't be afraid of it. Just know that it's just part of what we do.
Gina?
One thing that I want to emphasize is knowing what you have when you start. I always stress when I'm teaching the importance of measuring the quilt in several different places on the quilt, horizontally and vertically, because if you know what you have when you start, you can fix it and you can get that quilt square again. But you don't want any surprises down when you're getting down to the last row. And you don't want to have to rip stitches out. So that's one thing that I wanted to stress.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us for another episode of Digital Diary, and shrinkage is real. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.